In 2003, a 79-year-old man learned something about a single day in 1944 that changed everything he thought he knew about his own survival. For 60 years, George Herbert Walker Bush believed he had been lucky. On September 2, 1944, he was shot down over a tiny volcanic island in the Pacific. His plane caught fire. His 2 crewmates died. He floated alone in the ocean for 4 hours, bleeding from a head wound, vomiting from swallowed seawater, watching Japanese boats approach, and then a submarine surfaced, and he was saved. For 6 decades, that was the story. A young Navy pilot, a burning plane, a rescue against the odds, luck. But in 2003, an author named James Bradley contacted the former president. Bradley was researching a book about what happened on that island, what happened to the other American pilots who were shot down that day. The ones who didn't float away from shore, the ones the Japanese boats actually reached. What Bradley told Bush that day had been classified by the United States government for nearly 60 years. And when the former president heard it, he understood something he had never understood before. He wasn't lucky. He was the only one who wasn't captured. And what happened to the 8 men who were? The U.S. government had hidden from everyone, including the families of the dead, for more than half a century. This is the story of Chichi Jima, the island that ate American pilots. 600 miles south of Tokyo, a small volcanic island rises from the Philippine Sea, Chichi Jima. Just 8 miles long and 3 miles wide, barely visible on most maps of the Pacific. But in 1944, Chichi Jima was one of the most heavily fortified positions in the Japanese Empire. 25,000 Japanese soldiers occupied the island. They had dug tunnels through the volcanic rock. They had installed anti-aircraft batteries on every ridge. And most importantly, they had built a radio relay station that intercepted American military transmissions across the Pacific. Everything the Navy said, ship movements, carrier positions, bombing schedules, passed through Japanese ears on Chichi Jima. The station had to be destroyed. On September 1, 1944, the aircraft carrier USS San Jacinto received orders to launch a strike on the island. The radio tower was the primary target. Secondary targets included a communication center and supply depot. The pilots knew what they were flying into. Chichi Jima had some of the heaviest anti-aircraft concentrations in the Pacific theater. Previous raids had already cost planes and men. The Japanese gunners had learned exactly where American dive bombers would appear, and they had zeroed their weapons accordingly. But the mission was essential, and the pilots were young enough to believe they would be the ones who made it back. At dawn on September 2nd, 4 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers launched from the deck of the San Jacinto. Flying one of those Avengers was Lieutenant Junior Grade George Herbert Walker Bush. At 20 years old, he was one of the youngest pilots in the United States Navy. He had enlisted the day he turned 18, the same day he graduated from Phillips Academy in Massachusetts. He could have gone to Yale. His family expected him to. Instead, he signed up for flight training and became a naval aviator before his 19th birthday. By September 1944, Bush had already flown dozens of combat missions. He had been shot at over Wake Island, Marcus Island, and Guam. He had watched other pilots go down. He had learned the particular mathematics of survival that every combat aviator eventually internalizes, the understanding that luck was just another word for someone else getting hit. His crew that morning consisted of 2 men. In the turret sat Radio Man Second Class John Delaney, a regular member of Bush's crew who had flown with him many times before. Behind Delaney sat Lieutenant Junior Grade William White, the squadron's ordnance officer. White was not supposed to be there. Ordnance officers rarely flew combat missions. Their job was maintenance, arming torpedoes, loading bombs, ensuring the weapons functioned correctly. But White had asked Bush if he could come along. He wanted to observe a combat mission firsthand, to see what the pilots he armed actually faced in the air. Bush said yes. At 7:15 a.m., the 4 Avengers climbed away from the San Jacinto and turned northwest toward Chichi Jima. They saw the flak before they saw the island. Black clouds of exploding anti-aircraft shells filled the sky above Chichi Jima. The Japanese gunners had spotted the incoming strike force and opened fire from positions scattered across the island. Tracers streaked upward. Shrapnel pattered against aluminum wings. The lead Avenger began its dive, then the second, Bush watched both planes plunge toward the radio tower, release their bombs, and pull up through the curtain of fire. His turn. Bush pushed the nose down and felt the Avenger accelerate toward the Earth. The island rushed up at him, the radio tower, growing larger in his gun sight, the anti-aircraft positions flashing on every ridge. He could see the gun crews working their weapons, feeding ammunition, tracking his plane as it descended. Then something hit him. Bush later described it as a massive fist crunching into the belly of the aircraft. The Avenger shuddered. Smoke began pouring from the engine cowling. Bush looked at his instruments and saw the oil pressure dropping. Through the smoke, he could see flames rippling along the wing route, moving toward the fuel tanks. He had seconds, but he was almost on target. The radio tower was right there, centered in his gun sight. If he released now, if he held the dive just a few more seconds, he could complete the mission before the plane came apart around him. Bush held the dive. He released his bombs at the last possible moment, then hauled back on the stick and pulled the burning Avenger into a climb. The plane was dying. Smoke filled the cockpit. The controls were going slack in his hands. He had to get out. Bush later said he gave the order to bail out. He believed both Delaney and White heard him. He believed they jumped. But when Bush went over the side and his parachute opened, he looked back at the Avenger spiraling down toward the ocean. He saw only one other parachute, and it wasn't open. It was a white bundle falling alongside the plane, tumbling end over end, never blossoming. One of his crewmen had jumped, but his parachute had failed. The other crewman was still in the plane when it hit the water and disappeared. Bush drifted down toward the ocean, completely alone. The island was 7 miles away. He could see the Japanese boats already motoring out toward him. He hit the water hard. The impact with the airplane's tail section had gashed his forehead open, and now blood streamed down his face, mixing with the salt water as he struggled to release his parachute harness. The silk canopy was dragging him across the surface, threatening to pull him under. His fingers fumbled with the buckles. Finally free, Bush looked around for his life raft. Every Navy pilot carried a small inflatable raft packed into their seat. It was supposed to deploy automatically when they hit the water. But Bush's raft had only partially inflated. It was soft, barely buoyant, taking on water with every wave. He crawled onto it anyway. The situation was worse than he had initially understood. Jellyfish were everywhere in the water, and their stings burned his arms and legs wherever his flight suit had torn. He was vomiting from the seawater he had swallowed during the impact. His head wound kept bleeding, and the Japanese boats were getting closer. Bush could see them clearly now, 2 small vessels, motoring out from Chichi Jima, heading directly for the spot where his parachute had come down. The men aboard would have seen him descend. They knew exactly where he was. He began paddling with his hands, trying to put distance between himself and the approaching boats. His half-deflated raft moved painfully slowly. The boats kept coming. Then he heard the engines. American fighters from the carrier group had spotted the Japanese vessels. Grumman Hellcats came screaming down from altitude, their .5 caliber machine guns blazing. Waterspouts erupted around the Japanese boats as the fighters made pass after pass, driving them back toward shore. The boats turned around. Bush was alone again, but he was still alive. For 4 hours, George Bush floated in the Philippine Sea. He paddled east away from Chichi Jima, fighting the current that wanted to push him toward the island. His arms grew heavy. His raft kept losing air. Twice he had to blow into the inflation tube to keep it from going completely flat. The jellyfish stings swelled and burned. His head wound crusted over with salt. He vomited again and again, his stomach rejecting the seawater he could not stop swallowing. And he cried. Bush admitted this later in interviews conducted decades after the war. Floating alone in the ocean, surrounded by sharks and jellyfish, bleeding from his head, watching his raft slowly deflate. He was 20 years old. 2 men had just died in his airplane, and he was probably going to die too, either from exposure or from the Japanese boats that would eventually come back for him. He prayed. He thought about his family. He thought about his fiancée, Barbara, waiting for him back in Connecticut. He wondered if they would ever know what happened to him. Then something surfaced. Bush saw the shape rising from the water about 100 yards away, dark and massive, streaming water as it emerged. For a moment he thought it was a whale. Then he saw the conning tower. I said to myself, Geez, I hope it's one of ours. It was. The USS Finback, an American submarine on lifeguard duty, had been tracking Bush's position ever since he was shot down. The submarine had surfaced in the middle of Japanese-controlled waters, a tremendously dangerous maneuver specifically to rescue him. A sailor on the deck threw a line. Bush grabbed it. Hands pulled him aboard. He was so exhausted he could barely climb the ladder to the conning tower. Once on deck, dripping wet, bleeding, surrounded by American sailors, George Bush managed 4 words: "Happy to be aboard." But while Bush floated in the ocean, he was not the only American pilot who had been shot down that day. 8 other aviators were hit over Chichi Jima during the September 2nd raid and the missions that followed. Their planes had crashed closer to shore than Bush's. They had drifted toward the island instead of away from it. And unlike Bush, they were picked up by the Japanese boats. 8 American pilots captured alive, taken to Chichi Jima, turned over to the Japanese garrison. Their names were Lloyd Wilhoff, Grady York, Jimmy Dye, Glenn Frazier Jr., Marv Mershon, Floyd Hall, Warren Vaughn, and Warren Hinden Lang. Some of them were pilots, some were crewmen. All of them had survived their crashes. All of them had been pulled from the water by Japanese sailors, and all of them had been brought to the island. George Bush would spend the next 30 days aboard the USS Finback, participating in several more rescues of downed aviators. He would wonder constantly about the other men who had been shot down that day. He would hope that some of them had survived, that they were being held as prisoners, that they would be liberated when the war ended. He would not learn the truth for 60 years. The 8 captured American airmen were brought to the Japanese headquarters on Chichi Jima and presented to the island's commanding officer. Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana was a career military man with a reputation for ruthlessness. He had commanded the Chichi Jima garrison since early 1944, and he ran the island as his personal fiefdom. Under his authority, the 25,000 Japanese soldiers on Chichi Jima maintained absolute control over every inch of the territory. There were no escape routes. The nearest Allied forces were hundreds of miles away. Any American prisoner on Chichi Jima was completely at the mercy of Tachibana and his officers. The interrogations began immediately. The Japanese wanted information, the locations of American carrier groups, the schedules for future bombing raids, the names of squadron commanders and ship captains. They wanted anything the captured pilots could tell them. But the Americans gave nothing: name, rank, and serial number. That was all. This was standard practice for American prisoners. The Geneva Convention required captured servicemen to provide only basic identification information. Anything beyond that was voluntary. And despite whatever pressure the Japanese applied during those interrogations, the 8 American airmen held to their training. They told the Japanese nothing. Tachibana was not pleased. Within days of their capture, Tachibana ordered the American prisoners executed. There would be no POW camp for these men. There would be no transfer to Japan for formal imprisonment. There would be no prisoner exchange at the end of the war. Tachibana had decided their fate the moment they refused to cooperate. One by one, the American airmen were taken from their cells and brought to designated locations around the island. They were forced to kneel. Japanese officers stood over them with swords. The executions were conducted by beheading. This was not unusual in the Pacific Theater. The Japanese military did not recognize the Geneva Convention's protections for prisoners of war. Throughout the conflict, captured American servicemen were subjected to torture, execution, and other atrocities that violated every standard of civilized warfare. But on Chichi Jima, the killings were not the end. What happened next was something else entirely. Among the Japanese officers on Chichi Jima was a man named Vice Admiral Mori Kunizo. Mori had developed a belief shared by several other senior officers on the island that consuming human liver provided medicinal benefits. He claimed it cured a variety of ailments. He claimed it provided strength and vitality. He claimed it was a practice with ancient roots in Japanese culture. After the American prisoners were executed, Mori ordered the bodies brought to him. 4 of the 8 American airmen were cannibalized by Japanese officers on Chichi Jima. This was not survival cannibalism. The Japanese garrison was not starving. They had food supplies, equipment, ammunition. They were not desperate men resorting to the unthinkable in order to stay alive. This was ritual. The livers of American pilots were removed, prepared, and consumed by Japanese officers at formal dinners. On at least one occasion, the flesh was served with sake and vegetables. The officers who participated considered it a privileged demonstration of their superiority over the enemy. Lieutenant General Tachibana participated in these meals. So did Vice Admiral Mori. So did Major Sueo Matoba and Captain Shizuo Yoshi. These were not enlisted men or rogue soldiers. These were the senior commanders of the Chichi Jima, garrison the men responsible for the conduct of Japanese forces on the island. They ate the men they had murdered, and when the war ended, they did everything possible to ensure that no one would ever find out. In 1946, the United States conducted war crimes trials for the Japanese officers who had commanded Chichi Jima. The evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from Japanese soldiers who had witnessed the executions. Medical records showing what had been done to the bodies. Confessions from officers who had participated in the cannibalism. The investigators compiled a detailed record of exactly what had happened to the 8 American airmen. Tachibana, Mori, Matoba, and Yoshi were convicted. Tachibana and Matoba were sentenced to death by hanging. The others received lengthy prison terms. But then something unusual happened. The United States government classified the trial records. The official explanation was that disclosure would prevent honorable burial for the victims. The families of the dead pilots had been told their sons died in combat. Revealing the truth that they had been executed and eaten would cause unnecessary anguish. But there were other considerations as well. The war was over. Japan was becoming an ally. The United States needed Japanese cooperation for the occupation, for the Cold War, for the reconstruction of Asia. The last thing American officials wanted was a scandal that would permanently poison relations with the new Japanese government. So the records were sealed. The families never learned what really happened. And for nearly 60 years, the story of Chichi Jima remained one of the war's best-kept secrets. It would take an author named James Bradley to finally bring the truth to light. Bradley was an unusual researcher. His father, John Bradley, had been one of the Marines in the famous flag-raising photograph on Iwo Jima. The younger Bradley had written a best-selling book about that event called Flags of Our Fathers. During his research, he had stumbled across references to Chichi Jima, the island, just 150 miles north of Iwo Jima, and the classified war crimes trials that had taken place there. Bradley obtained the declassified documents. He interviewed survivors. He pieced together the complete story of what had happened to the 8 American pilots. And in 2003, he contacted the man who had almost been the 9th. George Herbert Walker Bush was 79 years old when James Bradley told him what had happened on Chichi Jima. By then, Bush had lived an extraordinary life. After the war, he had enrolled at Yale and graduated in just 2.5 years. He had moved to Texas and built a career in the oil industry. He had been elected to Congress, appointed ambassador to the United Nations, named director of the CIA. He had served 8 years as vice president and 4 years as president of the United States. Through all of those decades, he had carried the memory of September 2nd, 1944. The burning plane. The dying crewmates. He had told the story many times. He had received the Distinguished Flying Cross for completing his bombing run despite the damage to his aircraft. But he had never known what happened to the other pilots. He had assumed they died in their crashes or drowned in the ocean or were killed as prisoners of war. The specific details had never been available. The government had classified everything. Now Bradley was sitting in front of him explaining the truth. The executions, the beheadings, the cannibalism. According to Bradley, Bush listened quietly. There was no outburst, no visible shock. The former president simply absorbed the information with the kind of controlled composure that characterized his generation of veterans. But there was silence, and head shaking, and the unmistakable weight of understanding something terrible about a day he thought he already understood. There was a lot of silence, Bradley later said. There was no disgust, shock, or horror. He's a veteran of a different generation, but you could see him processing it. You could see him thinking about what it meant. What does it mean to survive when others do not? George Bush had asked himself this question before. He had wondered about Ted White and John Delaney, the crewmen who died in his plane. He had wondered if he could have done something differently, if he had pulled out of the dive sooner, if he had given the bailout order earlier, if he had waited another moment before jumping. But now the question had a new dimension. He had survived because he drifted away from the island, because the current carried him east, because American fighters strafed the Japanese boats, because a submarine captain decided to surface in enemy waters. The other 8 pilots survived their crashes too. They were alive when the Japanese pulled them from the water. The difference between George Bush and those men was not skill or courage or luck. The difference was 200 yards of open ocean. Bush had floated 200 yards farther from shore than the others. That was all. 200 yards, and the current, and the fighters, and the submarine, random chance, the chaos of war. Nothing he had done or failed to do. And for that he had lived 74 more years while they were beheaded and cannibalized by Japanese officers who faced no battlefield necessity, only their own darkness. "Why me?" Bush asked Bradley. "Why am I blessed? Why am I still alive? That's something I wonder about all the time." There is no answer to that question. Veterans ask it constantly, survivors of every war, every battle, every moment when the man beside them died and they did not. It is the fundamental mystery of combat. Why this one and not that one? Why me? Bush never found an answer. He simply lived with the question, as all survivors do. But there's one more part of this story. Not all of the prisoners on Chichi Jima were cannibalized. One of the captured American airmen survived the entire war. His name was William Connell. He was shot down over Chichi Jima and captured by the Japanese, just like the other 8. But for reasons that have never been fully explained, Connell was spared the fate of his fellow prisoners. He was held on the island until August 1945, when Japan surrendered and American forces finally liberated Chichi Jima. Connell spent the rest of his life knowing what had happened to the men who were captured alongside him. He knew about the executions. He knew about the cannibalism. He knew how close he had come to sharing their fate. In 2012, at the age of 88, William Connell finally did something he had been meaning to do for 68 years. He jumped out of an airplane. Connell had bailed out of his plane over Chichi Jima in 1944, but his parachute descent had ended with capture, imprisonment, and the knowledge that he was one of the lucky ones. In 2012, he completed the jump he never got to finish. He strapped on a parachute, climbed into a plane, and stepped out the door. This time, he landed among friends. On September 2, 1944, a submarine surfaced in enemy waters to rescue a 20-year-old Navy pilot. The footage of that rescue still exists. You can watch it grainy and black and white, shot by sailors on the deck of the USS Finback, a young man in a waterlogged flight suit being hauled onto the deck, thin, bleeding, exhausted, barely able to stand. That young man would spend the next 30 days on the submarine helping to rescue other downed pilots. He would receive the Distinguished Flying Cross for completing his bombing run despite his damaged aircraft. He would return home, marry his fiancée, Barbara, and begin building a life that would eventually lead to the White House. George Herbert Walker Bush flew 58 combat missions in World War II. He raised 6 children. He served as vice president for 8 years and president for 4. He lived to be 94 years old, dying peacefully in 2018, surrounded by family. For 74 of those years, he believed he had simply been lucky on September 2, 1944. He was wrong. He wasn't spared by luck. He was spared by 200 yards of open water, by a submarine captain named Robert Williams who decided to surface in daylight, by American fighter pilots who strafed the Japanese boats that would have taken him to that island, the island that ate American pilots. 9 men were shot down over Chichi Jima in September 1944. 1 floated away from shore and was rescued by a submarine. 8 were captured, tortured, executed, and in 4 cases cannibalized by Japanese officers who faced no battlefield necessity, only their own darkness. The U.S. government classified the truth for 60 years. The families of the dead never learned how their sons actually died. The war crimes trials were sealed, the testimony hidden, the horror buried in archives that no one was supposed to see. But the truth does not stay buried forever. In 2003, a 79-year-old former president finally learned what happened to the men he had served alongside. He learned why he was still alive when they were not. He learned that the difference between survival and horror was nothing more than the randomness of wind and current and the chaos of war. And he was left with the question that every survivor of every war eventually asks, why me? There is no answer. There never is. There is only this, to remember, to speak the names of the dead, to tell their stories so that they are not forgotten. Lloyd Walhoff, Grady York, Jimmy Dye, Glenn Fraser Jr., Marvin Rashawn, Floyd Hall, Warren Vaughn, Warren Hindenlang. They were American airmen. They served their country. They died on a tiny volcanic island in the Philippine Sea. And for 60 years, no one knew the truth. Now you do.